Welcome to this webinar on strategic sourcing. And this is intended for people in procurement and supply management who are at multiple levels. This is there is something in this for entry-level candidates when we describe the strategic sourcing process. It is for mid-level and senior-level managers. There is also some tips and techniques as to see how they're currently practicing strategic sourcing, whether they need to do anything different. And I hope at the end of this webinar you will learn the strategic sourcing process and how to calibrate the strategic sourcing process for maximum efficiency in your organization. To start with, I see a lot of new faces. This is I'll introduce myself. My name is Raghuraman. I'm one of the directors of ISM-INDIA, and I'm also the founder of BCube Global Solutions, a procurement and supply management consulting company based in Chennai, India. So a little bit of background about myself. I worked extensively in the US before returning to India, which is where I'm from. My entire life, my entire working career has been in procurement and supply management. In between, I did get an MBA degree from Purdue University in Indiana, and I worked predominantly in manufacturing as well as some consulting in procurement and supply management. And I've done a variety of roles within supply management. I've managed categories. I've worked on transportation sourcing. I've done a little bit of lean manufacturing. Worked a lot on the technology aspect of procurement and supply management. And I often I do train. I do a lot of training sessions for ISM as well as speak in conferences and so on. I'm also CPSM certified. It's a little bit. So I'm going to go a little bit into what we're going to be doing today. This is a quick look at the agenda for today. So the way this works is we're going to be I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes. So we started at 11:05. So I will be speaking probably until 11:50, and then we will open for questions at the end, where I'll take a few of the questions. That if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat window, or you can raise your hand. I will allow you the opportunity to speak at the end of 45 minutes, and then you can ask your question, so it is for everybody to hear. And if you have any technology issues, please do type in on the chat window. Arun from ISM India office will be monitoring the chat window, so he will get in touch with you if you have any trouble at all. So initially, I'm going to be talking about an introduction to the webinar and talk to you about what is strategic sourcing and how it is practiced around the world. And soon after that, we will be talking about the importance of strategic sourcing as a whole and what really do world-class organizations that have a fully functioning procurement function do. I'll also share a little bit of practical insights in terms of what the pain points are for us procurement professionals and how you can overcome them. And really, the approach that I will be going after is a strategic sourcing, the model of operation, where we'll talk to you about the various stakeholders involved, what are the various decisions that need to be made in strategic sourcing, and this is going to set us up for the actual process. What is the step-by-step process of strategic sourcing? What are the various steps involved, and also some insights and considerations as you move along this process. Bringing up the rear, I'll touch a little bit about what's in vogue right now, what are the current trends, which areas are organizations across the world tapping into, And then finally, we will finish. I'll do a quick recap for about 2-3 minutes, or maybe even 5 minutes, after which we will open for a Q&A session. I hope, yeah, everything works well. So let's go. Let's talk about an introduction. Before we get into the introduction, it is important that we understand how procurement and supply management as a function has evolved with time. So that's going to be my the start to our webinar. As I see it, there have been 4 major advancements in the practice of procurement as we know it now. And this is really from, I would say, even the 60s and 70s. This is when purchasing, which is what it was called, started. Initially, purchasing was purely an administrative function. It was purely clerical. It involved the dispatch of POs. It involved very little strategy, if at all there were any. And this is largely the practice for about a couple of decades, wherein towards the 80s, what happened was there was a shift towards purchasing as a function that was largely responsible for lowering the costs of operation. And because there was a focus on cost, there was a little bit of strategy involved, and organizations started looking strategically. And up until the late 90s and the early 2000s, we were still a cost center. And then was really the shift towards being a profit center, where, hey, you know, procurement is a means not just to lower the savings, but it's a means to actually influence the top line as well. So, and that involved a lot of emphasis on technology and analytics, and a new approach that looked at the total cost of ownership of a particular product or service. And how a procurement function evolves further from being a profit center is becomes a shared service provider, where you become very mature in terms of processes and technology that you use, and you contribute both to the top as well as the bottom line of an organization. So really, this has been the 4-stage evolution, if I may call it that, in our function. And since a large part of my audience is based in India, I will say that most companies in India are, you know, somewhere between 2 and 3. That is, somewhere between being a cost center and a profit center. Although there are a few organizations that are highly mature, they're leaning more towards, you know, in between a profit center as well as a shared service provider. So largely, Indian organizations are still, you know, they're making the leap between a cost center and a profit center. That is important as we go along this presentation in terms of how much it means to you. And so there was a poll, there was a survey done by the Aberdeen, which publishes a lot of statistics. And I'll encourage you, if you're doing market research, the Aberdeen group is it's I think aberdeen.com. It's a great resource for you to do research. So a poll was created among, you know, strategic sourcing organizations or functions within companies that were considered best in class, you know, in trying to understand what they do differently. And it was seen that roughly 77% of them had technology that could automate their sourcing process. About not just technology, but 81% of them had a formal sourcing process that they adhered to. And the important thing in creating a process is compliance to the process. Oftentimes, there are processes that are created, but compliance becomes a big problem. So it's not important just for you to create a process, but it's equally important to adhere to it. So 81% not just had a formal sourcing process, but they also made sure compliance was a high, they had high adoption rate. About 89% had a formal program that monitored performance of their suppliers, and they were also able to proactively identify and take appropriate measures to control risk. a pretty high portion of them, about 93%, invested in training in order to constantly upgrade their skill sets. Because what is real is that technology has changed the way we go about our everyday lives, and it is important in order to succeed or in order to keep up with the times. It is imperative that we stay up to date in terms of our skill sets. So I believe in the concept of lifelong learning, and every day you learn something new, and make sure you're open to new things and learn new things, and have that curiosity in you. And 84% of them performed proactive data analytics in order to get the long-term perspective. And this is something what best-in-class companies were doing. This survey is about, I think, 2 years old. This has obviously changed with time, but I think it gives you a sense of what areas really help you become a world-class procurement organization. I'll talk to you a little bit about. I understand, the reality is that there is all this looks great on paper, but in everyday life, you don't live in an ideal world. So there are a lot of pain points that we face on an everyday basis. If you're somebody at a senior management level, you invest heavily in training employees, and you bring the brightest and young minds on board, only to see them leave. That is a real problem that we face, as well as identifying quality talent. The talent in procurement is still a problem. There is also the question of resource constraints, where you have a bunch of things that you want to do, but there are not enough resources in order to help you achieve them. You have to prioritize between multiple projects and then choose to invest your resources. And there is a 360-degree pressure almost in this time and day to not just to cut costs, but you increase efficiency, maximize profitability. It really becomes very, very hard for procurement professionals to manage these multiple expectations. Also, there are certain times we do feel helpless in that there are a lot of things that are beyond our control, where there are macroeconomic factors at play that really influence rather significantly how we go about our everyday function. And these cannot be controlled. However hard we try, these cannot be controlled. And oftentimes, the time is procurement professionals spend a lot of time haggling with suppliers, fighting fires. And this is something that we can never get away from. Talking to suppliers, putting out fires is all a very inefficient use of time. But again, it is what it is. This is what happens on an everyday basis. And ultimately, what all this leads to is what I call a very undesirable condition, in which we tend to squeeze. We don't tend to focus on the relationship building with our suppliers. We tend to squeeze our suppliers for every little drop of every last dollar. So it is a disturbing trend, because it is long term. It is not in our best interest to do that. But again, hey, when there are a bunch of other factors at play, this is what it ultimately leads to. But while this is there, I'm not saying for certain that you can overcome all this if you have a fully functioning strategic sourcing methodology. But hey, it makes a big difference if you are able to institute a formal process of strategic sourcing and stick to it. I think it goes a long way in at least mitigating some of these issues. So that's a segue into the next topic, which is how do you approach this whole concept of strategic sourcing? I know for a fact that a lot of you will have a functioning strategic sourcing process. You may be at multiple levels of maturity within your organizations. You may be just starting down the path of strategic sourcing, or you may already have a fully functioning process at play. But this, for people that are just starting out, I think this can be a huge, this can be a good way to look at what are all the factors. While people that are already practicing it, you can see if, you can understand how it's working for you and see how you can recalibrate. The key in strategic sourcing is to be very reactive, to move away from a reactive environment, to move into a little bit of a proactive supply management. And exactly how do you do that? I think there are four major facets to a fully functioning strategic sourcing process. One is technology. You need to adopt. When I say technology, I don't mean that you use and you invest the right amount of money or capital on technology. Investing in technology just for the sake of investment doesn't really work. Understand which areas are critical, and there is a bunch of technology available in procurement, and choose and invest wisely. People are one of the most important pillars of a strategic sourcing process. Oftentimes, when you bring about a change or a transformation, the most vital cog in this entire transformation process is people. When you empower them and make them feel that they are the ones driving the change, which they are, you will face very little resistance to the actual change when people actually become the change agents. Also important in the transformation process is you foster the culture of continuous improvement, which is what I talked to you about, where life is a continuous improvement in itself. It's a learning process every day. And last but not the least, focus on having adopting best-in-class processes within your procurement function. And really, when you are looking at this, I would approach it from what we call at my company, BCube, what we call the procurement house of operations. So this is the operating model on which the entire, whatever the organization that you're in, whether you're in manufacturing or technology or in the public sector, this is how you should view your procurement operations. Really, so procurement, we're in between the suppliers as well as our internal clients, which are managing corporate expectations, and we really have an important role to play in terms of adding value to the organization. And how do we do that? I sort of view this in three major realms. One is the strategy function, which drives a lot of tops down. It has a huge direction in which it dictates the direction in which the organization moves. There is also the tactical responsibility or the daily work part, which is what we do on an everyday basis. And then there is the execution methodology element, which talks about the various processes and the frameworks that are there. Finally, the various tools and technology that exist that makes us good, that adds value to our everyday function. So moving on, there are four key decisions that one has to make as you're looking to make the leap towards a strategic sourcing organization. Number one is the operating model that you adopt. We'll talk a little bit about these four in the coming slides, but I'll do a quick overview about these. So processes and governance that sort of set the limits and boundaries for you as a strategic sourcing organization. As mentioned earlier, technology remains a key one, as well as workforce. So first up, the operating model. So there are largely two schools of thought. One is the centralized approach towards strategic sourcing, in which there is you're able to generate greater economies of scale. There's control and visibility. So this is, take the case of an organization where there are about 10 different plants, let's say 10 different offices across the country or across the world even. A centralized approach would mean that there is one organization that controls the procurement at all these 10 different locations. So that the benefits are, it provides for greater control and visibility. Policy making becomes a lot easier. On the flip side, if you have a decentralized model, it means that you're more in tune with the reality on what's happening on the ground. There is, if you need to make any changes to your process, it becomes a lot easier because the scope is only within one office or one location, not 10, as in the case of centralized operation. And you're able to also have stronger supplier relationships, where it becomes more of a value-driven approach towards relationships. But sometimes, let me go back to the centralized approach and see, hey, what can be some of the problems that you face with the centralized approach is typically when you consolidate the smaller players in terms of cost centers, internal cost centers, they're oftentimes overlooked. Implementation is almost always a complex phenomenon, and then internally, when you have multiple stakeholders, the goals and objectives are not aligned as well in a centralized approach. And the downside of a decentralized approach is that savings, because of a centralized approach, you can do the economies of scale. You can never maximize savings in a decentralized approach. You will give up on some of the savings. In terms of strategy and policy, you will oftentimes have multiple strategies and multiple policies which may interfere with each other. And the same goes true for tools as well. But one way to counter this is what a lot of organizations do these days. They follow a matrixed approach to procurement and supply. So they kind of take the positives out of both the centralized as well as decentralized approach and create a matrixed approach. Really, I think most organizations now in this world are somewhere matrixed. The percentage of centralized versus decentralized is different, but they're all matrixed, and that seems to be working well for them. Another important aspect to have a functioning procurement function is to have good processes in place. The two major processes for us are the source to contract as well as the procure to pay. These cover pretty much all of the functions that we do, and I'll skip through. I think most of you might know what these are. So the other important aspect of this is you need to have the right approach towards managing categories, and the way you do it is understand what you're buying and create appropriate categories which you already might have in an organization. Try to understand what you're buying and create one strategy for each category that you buy. And it is important that you don't follow the one-size-fit-all approach here. Each category is inherently different in terms of the cost levers, the way the industry operates, and you have to understand, while the framework can be the same, the various aspects of the strategy will be fundamentally different. And as you're managing categories, I think it's important that we mention, in this case, that Krishan Batra, who's the president of ISM-INDIA. In fact, this is a story that goes back, I think, maybe the late 80s or the 90s. Krishan is really a pioneer in procurement and supply. He was the one that instituted the concept of category codes, which is what we use to define categories. Basically, what we use is the UNSPSC code set. And Krishan was actually the head. He was working at the United Nations at that time, and he was the person that instituted the whole approach to category management, wherein this is a multi-tier hierarchy towards defining categories, and this is what is used by most organizations across the world. It's the UNSPSC code set. So I thought the code set was relevant, so I thought I'll mention it. Anyway, moving on, I think in terms of managing categories, you should also look at your contracts as well as compliance. And the benefits of having the right processes as well as the right approach towards managing categories is increased visibility for procurement within the organization, efficiency, cost savings, and greater control. The next is really, this is a concept that is quite close to me in terms of technology, because I have seen many a times, so many times, organizations adopt a particular tool or technology only to see it becoming not much of an aid, but it becomes more of an additional layer of complexity because the people that are using the technology feel it's not really maximizing the value, but it becomes more of a just another additional step to do that makes them less efficient. In about 10 years ago, there were very little tools that were focused on procurement and supply. Largely, we were reliant on ERP tools that had procurement, that also had procurement module. But really, in the last 10 years or so, there has been an explosion almost of tools that in fact even have a specialization. They focus on one particular area of procurement processes that I talked about the last time. So there is one of the decisions that you have to make in terms of technology is understand if you want to adopt an enterprise tool, which can be really expensive, or you adopt multiple tools within your procurement organization, wherein integration becomes an issue, where you have multiple tools that you want to try to talk to each other, it becomes more of a problem. And largely, the other thing that you also have to make is whether you need to invest in tool at all. Sometimes it's the most prudent approach would be to just do it as a service and then kind of see how it's working for you before eventually making the jump to a tool. The important thing while adopting technology is that you have to ensure before you invest in technology that you have fully functioning procurement processes within your organization. Oftentimes, I've seen companies think that, hey, they are investing millions of dollars on a tool, and they hope the tool will come in and set right the various inefficiencies that happen within the organization. Sadly, that has never quite worked well for companies in the past. It's always the procurement function that should lead the technology in terms of, hey, this is the scope for technology, this is what, it should dictate what the technology should and shouldn't do, rather than the other way around, where you have almost, the process frameworks within a tool dictating what procurement organizations should do. I think that is never a good sign. And also, an important thing, I talked about training earlier as well. I think people are the single most important element in any function, not just procurement. So ensure that they're happy, motivated, and they're exposed to the best practices, and they're constantly updated their skill sets. So really, I've talked a lot. I've still not gotten to the juice or the meat of my presentation yet. This is still a background. So what I'm going to talk about next is going to be really the actual process. And this is what is the meat. I think this can be different. Various consultants will tell you that there are 7 steps, that there are 9 steps, there are 5 steps. But inherently, if you break down if you combine it all together, the approach to it is very similar. There are largely three phases. I think if you look at the strategic sourcing process, there is an analysis phase, there is a execution of the strategic sourcing, which is oftentimes an event, an RFP or an auction, and then the continuous improvement phase, which is more of a supplier relationship management phase. So a strategic sourcing process will have the following sub-processes. So there is a lot of preliminary research that goes on. You do a lot of supply market analysis to understand. The research you do is more internal. You try to see, that is where you do the spend analysis, you do the category strategy for each category, sort of look inwards. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll jump through this 5 phases. So there is preliminary research, there is supply market analysis, there is the sourcing execution, and the process that happens after the sourcing event is the supplier onboarding, as well as the performance monitoring or the continuous improvement phase. So this is largely the 5 steps. It can be 7 based on the literature used, or it can be 9 even, but largely the approach is the same. And even if you want to simplify this further, it can be just 3 phases, analysis, execution, and continuous improvement. So what really happens in the analysis phase? I'll talk to you about, so as I mentioned earlier, the analysis phase is sort of looking inward as to understanding what you're buying, understanding various aspects about your suppliers, how they're performing, as well as creating strategy. So initially, before you go down the path of strategic sourcing, it is important that you create a criteria for selection of vendors. You understand your category in which you're buying, and you create selection criteria that will generate a huge list. So once you have the selection criteria, it becomes easy for you to generate a supplier universe for a particular category. While these two take up a little bit of time in terms of the analysis, largely in preliminary research phase, a lot of time is spent on creating the category profiles. This is where I know, I'm assuming most of you would have heard of the spend cube, which is the cube between what is spent, where is it coming from, and who is it coming from, largely. So that's the spend cube, where you understand your spend, the suppliers, and the cost centers. You also understand what the cost drivers or the cost levers are in each of the categories that you're trying to source, understand various trends in that particular category, and so on. So this remains the single most important aspect of a category profile in the preliminary research phase. And excuse me, I think I must have skipped 1 second. And the last aspect of the preliminary phase is the sourcing strategy. Once you understand which category you're trying to source, it is easy to create a sourcing strategy that will maximize the efficiency. I think I can talk to you later. We don't have time. I'm rushing forward. So there are the 4 quadrants where you organize your supply base into leverage, partnership. There's the Kralik portfolio purchasing model. You can just Google it. I think it'll be easy for you to understand. Let me just go forward with this because we're running short of time. When you look at the execution phase in terms of the strategic sourcing process, a lot of time is not spent on the research and preparation. It's procurement people, procurement professional thing. It's easy to put together a bid process. Just take a bunch of SKUs and put them in a bid package and then send them out to suppliers. It is not so. For you to maximize the results of strategic sourcing, you have to invest a lot of time in preparing for a sourcing event. What does preparation mean? It means that you have a really good bid document, you create appropriate bidding lots, you write as much as you can about the various specifications, set up the formats in which you want to receive the bids. The reason I'm stressing on this is that if you invest heavily in the preparation before the sourcing event, the execution as well as the onboarding, it makes the rest of the process very, very simple. So if you look at it, it's kind of like a funnel. So you start from a huge supplier universe that we created in the last step, and then you create a primary screen, which is largely research that you do online. You try to create, so you go from the approach towards this step, the execution, is you go from a large pool of suppliers to a limited set of suppliers who you want to involve in the strategic sourcing, the bid process, basically. So you start with a huge list of suppliers, and then you create a primary screen, which can be financial criteria, it can be research that you do online, and then you filter that list down. And then is who you send a request for information to, the RFI process, where you focus a lot on the operations and the financial criteria as well. And then moving on, you will do the actual sourcing event. Once you create a short list of suppliers, you know which ones to involve in the RFP or the auction. Now, auctions are being increasingly adopted by organizations across the world. It makes sense to do auctions, but only when you, only when the category is right. Only when cost becomes the real differential, and there's not many other differentials. Auction really helps in adding the maximum value. One important thing that you should note is at the end of the sourcing event, never sign a contract before physically meeting with a supplier or going to their site and doing this. And always, another important aspect is you focus on value, not just on cost. And finally, once you're done with the execution phase, really what is remaining is the onboarding of a supplier into your organization and the focus on continuous improvement. So if you look at it, it's a very simple process. You plan, communicate, onboard, and review. So there is, when you in the planning phase, you look at the various inventory, you identify and nominate resources for the onboarding process, and then prepare the supplier as well for onboarding. This is often in the case of new suppliers, suppliers that you've never worked with before. One important thing not to miss is the communication aspect of it, where oftentimes procurement function works in isolation. It is important that you work with other functions within your organization, be it sales or engineering or IT. Communicate with them about the change that you're making and this helps in moving this process much faster. Once you have this ready, you'll be able to integrate the supplier into the various systems and processes that you have. And really, what goes on after this is a huge, it's almost, it can take one webinar to explain the supplier relationship management aspect. I think we're doing one webinar on supplier relationships as well, on how you assess their performance and kind of provide feedback and grow with your suppliers. So largely, that is the approach, that is the process to strategic sourcing. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about current focus areas. What are organizations doing? I mean, we have been doing this for about 10-15 years, and what are the current areas of focus? And this is especially provided with an Indian context. We are now looking largely at indirect, not just indirect, but also tail spend. What is tail spend? Indirect, I'm sure you already understand what indirect spend is. That is, largely your spend is divided into two. Direct material, which is fundamentally what drives your organization forward, and the supporting spend, which is all in it. So the categories can be anywhere. So the categories can be, for example, what you spend on marketing and advertising, what you spend on professional services, facilities, spend on IT, HR. Again, this is dependent on which industry you are in, but largely these are the types of indirect spend. And the tail of the indirect, which is really the last, the rear. If you look at spend as a huge snake, a long snake, really the tail spend is the last 5% of your spend. If you sort your spend between volume-wise, which categories bring up the rear is the tail spend. So if I can give you an example, let's assume you have $1 million of spend. 100 million makes it easier, sorry. $100 million of spend, largely direct material would be around 85%. So that would take care of the 85 million of your 100 million would be in direct material. The remaining 15 is an area where there is lower visibility, there is not a greater you have too many suppliers in that 15 million that brings up the rear, and still driving down one level deeper is when you get the bottom, I would say 10% of your indirect, so which largely puts us in the $1.5 million ballpark. Is you have thousands of suppliers, and this brings up the tail. And what characterizes tail spend typically? There is very little contract compliance. Oftentimes there is no visibility and there's no contracts at all. These are ad hoc purchases, one-time spend. Once you focus on tail spend, you can do. It oftentimes generates double-digit savings. It's a huge cost. As organizations are looking to save, this becomes a gold mine almost, because fundamentally strategic sourcing or procurement organizations don't look at tail spend. So this becomes a gold mine. You also have the opportunity to consolidate suppliers, wherein you move from 10,000 suppliers to hopefully a few hundred. And you also have the option to establish policy and governance in areas that are completely new, that you don't have visibility into, that you don't have control into. Once you bring them under the wing of procurement, you're able to establish processes. So largely this is an area where more organizations are currently grappling with, and they're finding out ways in which they can be efficient in managing their indirect and tail spend, I should say. Another area which is also being looked at by supply management now is transportation, warehousing, and packaging, where you look at optimizing your inbound and outbound networks in terms of route planning and whatnot. Integrating with 3PLs, because if you're, let's say, integrating with 3PLs and warehousing, as well as I mentioned, and packaging as well. So this largely is, that brings us to the end of this webinar. I'll do a quick run through of what we talked about, and then we'll open for questions. Feel free to raise your hand. You can see that little icon that you're able to raise your hand, or you can chat and ask your questions. So let me go to the beginning of the slide, and then quickly run through what we talked about. So we talked a little bit about myself, what we're going to see. So we looked at the evolution of procurement, the 4 stages of procurement from the 70s to until now. from being an admin center to a cost center to a profit center and ultimately a shared service provider. And understood what best-in-class companies do different. They looked through the various pain points of a typical procurement / professional. And that led us to the approach for strategic sourcing, sort of the procurement house, as I call it, that helps you with the transformation. So the 4 elements of a transformation, which will be technology, people, processes, and a culture of continuous improvement. And look at the understanding. And I say this is important because even if we have a functioning procurement operation, it is almost always very important that you audit. You have you bring in an external organization to see if everything is working right. A new set of eyes almost to see the way all the processes and the flows happen within your organization. Are they efficient? Are the tools that you're using really helping you become more intelligent and efficient? It's important that you do this audit every once in a while to ensure you're best geared for success. In the foundation, you look at a 3 or 4 or the 4-pronged approach. Is a strategy, defining the responsibilities and daily work, setting up processes, and adopting the right tools. We looked at 4 key decisions that you make in terms of which operating model that you use, establishing various processes and governance structures, technology, and workforce. So we looked at the matrix structure, looked at a couple of processes. In fact, my next webinar will be going in depth into this area, which is the various processes and sub-processes within procurement, the source to contract and the procure to pay, as well as a little bit about what technology is available in these areas that help you become better at these processes. And largely, so these are the 2, the previous slide and this slide is what I'll be going in depth on in my next webinar. I think that's set for March. We looked at workforce considerations, and really then we defined the actual process of strategic sourcing, which is research, analysis, execution, onboarding, and continuous improvement. We looked at what happens in the analysis phase. We looked at the execution phase, where you go from a list of suppliers to ultimately choosing the supplier that offers you the best value. And once you choose the supplier, the process then becomes a plan to onboard the supplier into your system. And once we understood the process, we looked at a few key areas that organizations are focusing at: your indirect tail spend, as well as transportation and packaging. So thank you again for your time. I hope this was useful. Let me